In this video, we are going to learn how to create a table based on an array of data. We will add new data to our table using a form. We will make inline edits and delete rows. We will be building this one from scratch, and the links to the completed code are in the description. I've used Create React App to create an empty React project here. Nothing too special, just the index files and an app.js file with an empty component within it. If you want to follow along, this is all you need to start. We will start this one by creating the table and adding some static data. In React, we create tables using the same tags as we would if it were regular HTML. So in our app.js file, we will add a div with a class name of app container. This just helps us position the table. Within this div, we will add the tags we need to create our table. First, we'll add the table tag, which indicates that this is the start of our table. Then we will add the table head tag, which will contain our column headings. This isn't required, but it helps to differentiate different things when looking at the DOM. So in here, we will add a row using the tr tag, and within this, we will add our table headings using the th tag. So we are going to have 4 columns to begin with, which is the name, address, the phone number, and the email. We will add this actions column in later. So we'll go ahead and add these to our table. So we'll say the name, address, phone number, and email. So that's our headings in place. Now we will do similar with the body. We will take a new line after the table head tags and add the table body tags. In here is where we put the rows of data that we want to display in our table. So again, we'll add a tr tag. And since we have 4 columns, we need to add 4 table data tags with some static data. So add TD, and we will add a name, we'll say Jenny Chan, and for an address, put in a fake address and a phone number. And finally, we'll put in a email address. Each of these cells matches up to one of our columns in the header. To make the table look a bit nicer, I've added some simple styles, which you can grab from the GitHub link in the description. Just click on the link, and down here you should see a bunch of styles. So what we want to do is copy everything, and back in the code we want to create a new style sheet in the source folder called app.css, and then just paste all the styles you copied in here and click save. Remember to import it into app.js. We'll do import open quotes /app.css. Now, if we start this by opening the terminal and typing npm start, you can see our table has appeared. So we have our 4 column headings, and we have a row of data just below it. This is nice, but it's not very useful since the data is static. What we want to do is dynamically render the rows based on some sort of data. So again, I've created some mock data for us to use. If you're following along, go to the link in the description and copy the JSON, which you can see here. So it's just an array with some data. So we'll copy this, and back in our code in the source folder, we will create a new file called mock-data.json, and we'll paste it in like so. This data is an array of contacts. Each object in the array has data that matches the columns in our table. So we have the name, the address, and so on. Now in app.js, we're going to import this. So say import data from open quotes /mockdata.json. Now we have an array of contacts. We're going to pretend that we called an API, and this is the data that we got back. In other words, we are just mocking the data. Since our table rows are dynamic and the data is likely to change, it makes sense to store this data in state. That way, when the data is updated, React will update the UI components for us. So just at the top of our app component, we will take a new line, and then we'll say const contacts, comma, set contacts. It's going to be equal to useState, and we'll import the useState hook from React, and we want to initialize our useState hook with the data that we got from the mock-data.json file. So we'll just pass it in like so. So all we're doing here is taking the data and storing it in state using the useState hook. And now this state is available via the contacts variable, and we can update the state with the set contacts function. Now we have some data to work with. What we want to do is render a table row for each object in our array. To do this, we will use the map function to loop over our array of contacts, which we just stored in state up here, and output the row. So just inside the table body tag, we will take a new line, open some curly braces, and then we will say contacts.map, open our braces, and we're going to pass in an arrow function. And then we're just going to cut the current row that we have. So everything inside the tr tags, and just paste it after our arrow. So now we have a map function, which is going to output a row for each contact in our contacts array. So now we just need to display the data for a given contacts, as opposed to this static data that we've added already. So as the map function blips through the contacts array, it will give us access to the current contact object it is currently on and passes it to our function as a variable. We will name this variable contact. So now we have access to the contact object. We can display the data in our table row. So we will delete this hard-coded stuff, and for the first column, we will say contact.full name, contact.address, contact.phone number, and contact.email. So all these properties are just coming from the contact object, which is part of the mock data array. So we have full name, address, phone number, and email, and we're just displaying these in our table row. So now if we try this in Chrome, you can see we have a bunch of rows. Each one has a contact, which is taking from the data in our mock data file. This is cool because if we change the data, it all just works. So if we add a new row to our mock data JSON file, so I'll just copy one here and paste it, and then we'll say new contact, just so we can see things change. Jump back into Chrome, you can see it's appeared. This is how we make table rows dynamic in React. It doesn't matter where your data comes from, whether it's an API call, props, or whatever. You just store the data in state and map over it in the body of your table. Now we are going to look at adding data to our table with a basic form. So in our finished app, we have this form which appears at the bottom. If we add some stuff and click add, it appears in the row. There are a number of form frameworks you can use to create a form, but to keep things simple, we're going to use a plain old HTML form. Let's start by putting our form in place. So just below the closing table tag, we will add a h2 tag just to separate things out. And then we'll say add a contact. And just below this, we will add our form tag. So in here, we will add 4 inputs, 1 for each of our columns. So we'll do an input. The type will be text. The name, we are going to name the same as the property in the object in our contacts array. So we'll say full name, which is what we've called it up here. And then we'll say required is required. And then we'll just add a placeholder that says enter a name. So now we're just going to copy this one and paste it just below and change some things to match our columns. So the next one we have is address. So say the name for this input will be address, and we'll change the placeholder, enter an address, and we'll do the same again for the next one, which is phone number. So we'll say the name will be phone number, enter a phone number, and the last one is email, I think. Yep, so we will add an input to capture the email. Change the name to email, and we'll say enter and email. And the type for this one is going to be email. And finally, we're going to add a button with a type of submit, and then we'll say add for the text on the button. So when this button gets clicked, provided the form is valid, it will submit the form. So if we have a look at Chrome, you can see our form has appeared. It doesn't look the best, but it will do for now. And if we try to submit this without the values being correctly filled, it will give us a plain old error, which is what we want. So when working with forms like this in React, we need to store the form values in state and update the value as the user types. The simplest way to do this is to store the form values as an object in a single state hook and use an event handler function to update the values. Back in our code, at the top of our function, just under the contacts state hook, we want to add a new one. So we'll say const add form data. So this is the data for our add contact form. And we'll say set add form data. And this will be equal to use state. And we're going to initialize this to be an object. So in here, we're going to have a different property for each input field in our form. So we'll have one for full name, address, phone number, and email. So we'll just add these in. We'll say full name, and we'll default this to an empty string, address, phone number, and email. Notice how the spelling and the case are the same as the name attribute which we give to our input in our form. This is because we're going to use the name of the input to determine what input field and input value has changed. Now we will create a function that gets called when the user changes a value in any of the inputs. So all our inputs will be linked to this new event handler that we will create. Just beneath our state hooks, we will create an arrow function called handle add form change. And this will be equal to an arrow function that accepts the event. In here, we want to do event.prevent default. The first thing we want to do is get the name of the input the user has changed. So in here, we'll say const field name is equal to event.target.get attribute, and we'll pass in a string, and within the quotes, we will say name. So this will get the name attribute of whichever input the user has typed into and assign it to the field name variable. Next, we want to get the actual value that the user has entered into the input. So we'll say const field value is equal to event.target.value. Next, we will make a copy of the existing form data so that we can change it without mutating the state. So we'll say const new form data is equal to, open our curly braces, do 3 dots, and then we'll say add form. We're just using the spread operator to copy the existing form data and assign the new data to this variable. Next, we will update the object with the new value the user has typed. So we can say new form data, open our square braces, pass in the field name, and this is going to equal to the field value. Remember that the new form data variable is an object, so we can use the square bracket syntax to get a given key. So for example, if our field name is phone number, this will get the phone number key from our object and assign whatever the user has typed to it. Lastly, we will set this into state by saying set add form data and passing in our new form data. Now we just need to call this function when any of our inputs change. So to do this, in our input tags, we will add the onChange property, and this will be equal to the handle add form change. When we specify a function call like this, React will automatically pass in the event for us. So all we have to do is copy this and paste it into the rest of our inputs. So we'll paste it into the address, into the phone number, and finally into the email field as well. So now if we open up Chrome and open up our DevTools, and if we have a look at the Components tab, you can see in our app component, we have our state hooks, and the second hook has our add form data. So it starts off as empty strings, but as we change some of these, you can see things start to update in state as well. So the reason why we do it like this is because it makes it easier to add new values to our form. We just add a new input to our form, add a new property to the initial state, and call this event handler, and it will all work. This also means we don't have to have separate event handlers and state hooks for each input in our form, which can make the code quite repetitive and hard to follow. Have a play around with this and understand how it works. It's a good piece of code which can be used almost anywhere that you need a form, so it's good to know how it works. Now we have our form values stored in state. and some basic validation, we will add a function that gets called when the form is submitted. So just below our handle add form change function, we'll create a new function called handle add form submit. And this will be equal to an arrow function, which takes the event. And just like before, we want to do event dot prevent default, just to prevent the form from doing a post request when it's submitted. And here, what we want to do is take the data that the user has entered into the form, which we have stored in the add form data state object, and create a new object from this. So we'll say const new contact is equal to an object. So say the full name is going to be equal to add form data dot full name address. It's going to be add form data dot address. Phone number will be add form data dot phone number, and finally email will be add form data dot email, like so. And we also need to add an ID in here because we will use the ID later to identify which contact we are editing or trying to delete. So we'll say ID, and we're going to say nano ID, open and close braces. So we just need to import this. So we'll scroll to the top, and then we'll say import open braces nano ID from nano ID. All this does is generates an ID for us, and back in our function we will create a new contacts array to avoid mutating the state. We'll say const new contacts is equal to open braces, and we will copy the current contacts by using the spread operator, and then we'll do a comma, and then we will add the new contact object that we just created to the end of this new array, like so. And finally, we'll do set contacts and pass in our new array. Remember, any contacts we add must have the same properties as our existing contacts, or else things will act a bit funny. So now we can call this function when our form is submitted. So we'll scroll down to our form, and then we'll add the onSubmit property, and this is going to be equal to our function. So we'll save this, and now if we try in Chrome, if we refresh this, we'll say it is a new contact, and then just add some other stuff in here. And if we click add, you can see it appears at the bottom. Now, if we refresh, this will disappear because it's only saved in the local state. This next feature is a pretty good one I get asked about a lot. How do you edit a table row inline? What we're going to do is effectively have two rows. One row is going to be hidden and will contain the inline form, which looks like this. The other row will be a visible read-only row like we currently have. We will have an edit button, which when clicked will display the row with the inline form. Whenever we click the save button, this will update the state. Okay, so we're in app.js. Most of the work for this section will be done just within the table body tags where we display the rows. Things could get a bit messy in here. What we're going to do is split things out into different components so that they're easier to follow. So we're going to have a component for the read-only row, which is what we currently have, and we will create a new component for the inline form row. So in the source folder, we're going to add a new folder called components, and in here we will create a new file called read-only-row.js, and in here we will create a React component as normal, and we're going to jump back into app.js, and we're going to cut and paste the current row markup from inside the map function and paste it inside the return statement of the read-only row component, like so. As you can see, the IDE is saying there are some things missing that the component relies on. We will pass these in as props. Whenever we pass props to a component, we can destructure it. So we'll add our curly braces, and in here we will say contact. When we render this component, which you'll see in a minute, we're going to pass in the contact, and our component can render the details based on the contact object. So now we'll jump back into app.js and render our new component in place of the old code by saying read-only row, and we will pass in the contact as a prop. So we'll say contact is equal to contact, and we need to import our component. So we'll scroll to the top, I'll say import read only row, and it's auto completed it for us, which is good. So now if we save this and have a look at Chrome, it should work the same, and it does, which is good. Next, we're going to create our edit row component. This is the component that holds the inputs that lets our user update the values for a given row. So again, in the source components folder, we will create a new file called editable row.js, and we will create our component. This component will be similar to the read-only row component in that it will have a table row. So we'll add our tr tags with a bunch of cells. Add a few TDs in here. We will add 4 because we have 4 columns. Each cell in this row will have an input, and we will keep these inputs in the same order as our columns. So in the first TD, we're going to have an input, and we're going to say type is equal to text. We will say required is equal to required. Placeholder will be enter a name, and the name of this input is going to be full name. So this is the input that lets the user edit the full name for a given contact in a row. We will do the same for the rest. Just like before, we're going to copy and paste the input and change the things that we need. So the next one is address, which is our second column. So in here, we'll say enter an address, and the name will be address, and we will do the same for the phone number and the same for the email. So we'll say please enter a phone number, and the name is going to be phone number, and we'll do one more for the email. Please enter an email, and the name will be email, and we'll change the type to be email as well. Okay, so that's our inline form in place. For now, we will render both rows so we can see what's happening. In app.js, render the editable row just above the read-only row. So in here, we'll say editable row, and we need to import it. So we'll say import editable row from /components/editable row, and add a semicolon at the end. And now we'll save. So now it's saying we can't have two children components like this. So we need to add a React fragment. So we will import the fragment from React, and just inside the map function, we will add a fragment tag like this. And then we're just going to cut our two components, take a few spaces inside the fragment tag and paste it in. And if we save, this looks good. Now we have our two rows. What we ideally want to do is wrap the editable row in a form tag so that we can handle the form submit and capture the inputs which live in the editable row component. Although when we do this, we get a problem in Chrome which says invalid DOM nesting, a form tag cannot appear as a child of the table body, which is a problem. What we need to do is, instead of wrapping our components in the form tag, we will remove these and we will wrap the entire table in the form tags instead. This approach is fine, as we will only ever have one set of form inputs being displayed in the DOM at any one time, which means the form inputs will not be duplicated and cause any funny issues. Okay, so now if we save this and have a look at Chrome, you can see there are two rows rendered for each contact in our list. One is the read-only view, and the other is the view to edit the fields. Okay, so now we have this in place. Next, we'll look at toggling between these two rows and adding a button which will let us save the new values that the user entered. As you can see in the finished app here, whenever we edit, we have the save button in the actions column. Since we only want to edit one row at a time, what we will do is add an edit button, and when this button is clicked, it will store the ID of the contact we are editing in state. We will then use this ID to determine whether to show the editable row or the read-only row when we render the lists of contacts. So in our code, we will start by adding a new state hook. So we'll say const edit contact ID, comma, set edit contact ID is going to be equal to use state, and we will default this to null. So if the edit contact ID is null, that means the user isn't editing any row. Now we want to add a ternary to render either the editable row or the read-only row, depending if we have an edit row ID or not. So in our fragment, we will take a new line, open our braces, and then we'll say edit contact ID is equal to the contact.id. And then we'll do a question mark, and then we will paste in our editable row just after the question mark. And just outside the closing brace of our component, we'll add a semicolon. And just after the semicolon, we will paste in the read-only row component. And if we save this, it should format it nicely for us. So as the map function loops through the array, if the ID of the current contact object matches the ID stored in state in the edit contact ID state hook, then it will render the editable row. If not, it will render the read-only row. This syntax acts like an if statement and is a good shorthand way to determine between one or two options. We can test this by looking at our mockdata.json file. So our second element, Jessica Warren, has an ID of 2. So if we store this in our initial state in app.js, so we'll set the edit contact ID initial state as being 2, it should render the editable row component for Jessica. If we refresh, you can see it has. Before we move on to pre-filling and saving the form for an edited row, we want to add an edit button to each row, which will update our edit contact ID state hook. So in app.js, we will add a new column to our table header called actions. For now, we will have an edit button, but eventually we will have some other stuff depending on the state. Before we add the button, we will add the event listener function. This will be called when the user actually clicks the edit button. Just beneath the handle add form submit function, we will take a new line and say const handle edit click, and this will be equal to an arrow function, which will accept the event as well as the contact. So this accepts the contact because we need to know the ID of the contact for that row so that we can save it into state. So in here, we will say event.prevent default, and then we'll do set edit contact ID, and then we'll pass in the contact.id. So we put this event handler function here so that it's close to the state that needs updating. In this case, the edit contact ID state object. Next, we will pass this function to our read-only row component as a prop, as this is where our edit button is going to be. So we'll say handle edit click will be equal to handle edit click. Next, we will jump into read-only row.js, and we will destructure the handle edit click prop by saying comma handle edit click, and we will add a new row cell at the end by adding another TD. In here, we will add a button which calls the handle edit click function. So we'll say button, the type equals button, and we'll give it a text of button, and then we'll say on click equals an arrow function, and the event will get passed to our function by React, and then we'll say handle edit click, passing in the event and passing in the current contact, which we get from props. Remember, we need the contact so that we can get the contact ID and save it into state. So let's try this in Chrome, and actually we will jump back into app.js and remove the value we added to our edit contact ID back to null. Now we have the edit buttons up here. If we click edit for this, it changes the row to be the editable row. And if we click edit for a different row, it does the same. Whoops. This last one looks a bit funny. So if we refresh, let's have a look at our mock data to see what happened. And I think it's because we added one earlier and they have the same ID. Yeah, so because these both have the same ID, when our map function runs, our edit contact ID, which is saved in state, is going to be 5. So it's going to render the editable row for both of these rows. So what we'll do is delete it for now and save, and we'll try again. So if we click edit for a row, it toggles the rows. And if we try a different one, it resets the old row and toggles the new row. So this works because whenever the button is clicked, the state changes and sets the edit contact ID. The component re-renders because the state changes, and our ternary operator runs again. Now we have the editable row showing up. We want to repopulate the form, and we want to add a save or cancel button to the actions column for that row. Remember, the editable row is essentially a form similar to our add new contact form. So we will start by creating a new state object to hold the form data for when we are editing a given row. So in app.js, just beneath the add form data state hook, we will take a new line and I'll say const edit form data, comma, set edit form data. This will be equal to use state, and just like before, we're going to pass in an object which has the same properties as our form inputs. What we're going to do is actually copy this and paste it in. You could possibly do something a bit clever in here and reuse the same state hook depending on adding or editing a form, but for the purposes of clarity, we're going to use two separate state hooks. Next, similar to what we did with our add contact form, we want to update the state when any of the form values change. We will create a function similar to the handle add form change. So we'll take a new line just beneath this function. Let's say const handle edit form change, which will be equal to an arrow function. This function will accept the event. In the body of the function, we will say event.event default, just like before. And we will get the field name. This will be equal to event.target.get attribute. And we'll pass in the name. And we will also get the field value. So I'll say const field value equals event.target.value. Now we want to create a new object based on the new values so that we don't mutate the state. We'll say const new form data is equal to open braces to create a new object, and then we will use the spread operator to copy the edit form data. Just like we did previously, we're going to use the square bracket syntax on our object to update the value for a given field. So we'll say new form data, open and close our square braces. We'll pass in our field name, and it's going to be equal to whatever value the user has typed, which in this case is field value. And then we will set this to state. So we'll do set edit form data and pass in our new form data. Now we have a way to store the form data. We want to pre-populate it with the contact data from that row when the user clicks the edit button. In our handle edit click function, we already pass in the event and the contact as parameters. So all we need to do is take the values from the contact object and save it to our edit form data. So we will create a new object called form values. This will have the same properties as our edit form data state object up here. So it's going to have a full name, address, a phone number, and an email. The same as the values we have been working with so far. So in our form values object, we will say full name. This will be contact dot full name. So remember, the contact gets passed in when the edit button is clicked. We'll say address is equal to contact dot address. The phone number will be contact dot phone number, and the email will be contact dot email. And we will set this to state by saying set edit form data and pass in the form values. So now we have a way to save the values to state and an event handler to update the state. We can pass these to our editable row component. So in the editable row component, we will pass our form data. So we'll say edit form data is going to be equal to edit form data. And we will pass in our function to update the form values in state when the user types by saying handle edit form change is equal to handle edit form change. In our editable row component, we will destructure these. So we'll say edit form data and handle edit form change. So we want to call our handle edit form change function to update the form values in state whenever our inputs change. So we will add an onChange event to each input. We'll say onChange is equal to handle edit form change, and we will paste this to the rest of our inputs. So anytime each of these inputs change, we will store the value for that input in state, similar to what we did with the add contact form. So we want to pre-populate the input field values with whatever is in the edit form data prop object. So we can add a value to each input. We do this by specifying the value prop on the input. So we'll say the value is going to be equal to open braces edit form data dot full name. And we will do the same for the rest. So we'll say value is equal to edit form data dot address for the phone number is equal to edit form data dot phone number. And lastly, for the email, we'll say value equals edit form data dot email. Lastly, we will add a new table cell to this row with the save button in it. Even though the actual form tag is outside the component, it doesn't matter. This button will still submit the form because it's nested within the form tags when it gets rendered to the DOM. So we'll add a TD, and if we go ahead and add a button, type will be submit so that it submits the form, and the text will say save. Now if we try this, we should have an editable row with pre-filled values for a given row. So we'll click edit on Tony Frank, and as you can see, it's displaying the editable row component, which has our form, and it's also pre-filled the values for that row. And if we click another one, you can see our component re-renders, and it does the logic to work out which row to show and pre-populates as well. This seems to be working fine, so let's check if our state is updating. So unfortunately, these hooks aren't named, but they are in order. So if we look at our code in app.js, you can see the edit form data is the third hook. That's the one we look for in the DevTools. So our third hook is here. If we expand it, you can see each time we edit or click the edit button that our state is getting updated with the data from that row. And let's see what happens if we change the address. So if we delete it, you can see the state's getting updated. If we type some stuff, it's getting updated as well. So even though our save button's not working, we are able to check that our logic to save the actual form values in state is working. This seems to be looking good. Now we just need to save the form when the user clicks the save button. Similar to the add new contact functionality, we will create a new event handler function in app.js. So just beneath handle add form submit, we will say const handle edit form submit. This will be equal to an arrow function that accepts an event. And here we will do event dot prevent default, so the page doesn't try and do a post on form submit. And just like before, we will create a new object based on the new data stored in the edit form. So we will say const edited contact will be equal to an object, and we will say full name is edit form data dot full name, and same for address. Address will be edit form data dot address. Phone number will be edit form data dot phone number, and email will be edit form data dot email. We also want to keep the ID in place as we need it to determine what row we are editing. So we will take this from the edit contact ID. So just below this, we will create a new contacts array, so we don't mutate the state. And this will be equal to an array, and we will copy the existing contacts by using the spread operator and the contacts variable. This time, instead of adding the new contact to the end, we want to replace the contact object in the contacts array with this new object we just created. If we are editing the second row, we want to update the array at position 1, and if we're updating the first one, we want to update position 0, and so on. So the first thing we need to do is get the index of the row that we are editing. Back in our function, we will say const index is equal to contacts dot find index, open braces, and we'll pass in a function. So the find index array method will return an index based on a condition that we pass in. So the find index function will pass the current contact to our function, and then we want to say find the index of the contact.id is equal to the edit contact ID. Remember, the edit contact ID is the row that we're editing. We want to get the index of that row in the contacts array. Now we have the index, we can update the array at the given position. So we'll say new contacts, open our square braces, and we'll pass in the index. So the contact at this position in the new contacts array is going to be equal to our new contact that we created up here called edited contact. Lastly, we set our new array into state and set our edit contact ID to null as we're finished editing, and this will hide the editable row. We'll say set contacts to be the new contacts array that we just created with the updated contact object, and then we'll do set edit contact ID to be null. So if we try and edit Tony Frank, and we will just add some stuff in here so we can see the data has changed. So we've just updated these inputs, and if we click save, it didn't work. So let's have a look and see what we missed. So if we jump into our function, oh, it's saying handle edit form submit is declared but never used. So we forgot to add our function to our form. So if we scroll down, remember our edit contact form wraps the table. This is the form we want to add our onSubmit to. So I'll say onSubmit is equal to handle edit form submit, which should hopefully fix our error, and it does. So let's jump back into Chrome and try it again. So we'll try edit in Tony Frank again. Say update, add some stuff in the rest of these fields. And now if we click save, you can see it's updated with the new data. If we click edit and we try to delete something, the form validation should kick in, and it does. So to finish off this feature, let's add a cancel button. So in our finished app, if we make some changes and then decide that we don't want to change this contact anymore, we just hit cancel and the changes are not saved. So to cancel, all we want to do is set the edit contact ID back to null. Remember, the editable row only renders if the edit contact ID matches any given contact ID in our contacts array. Otherwise, the read-only row is rendered. So just above our return function in app.js, we will create an event handler for our cancel button. So we'll say const handle cancel click. This will be equal to an arrow function. And all we have to do in here is say set edit contact ID to be null. And we will pass this event handler to our editable row as a prop. So we'll say handle cancel click is equal to handle cancel click. And in editable row.js, we can destructure this. So we'll say handle cancel click. And just below our save button, we'll add a new button with a type of button, and we'll say cancel. And whenever this is clicked, we will call our handle cancel click function that we passed in as a prop. So now if we try this, and if we edit Jeremy this time and just add a bunch of stuff in here, and if we click cancel, you can see it doesn't update the state and it renders the read-only view. The final thing we want to look at in this course is how to delete a contact. If we look at our finished app, we have a delete button, and if we click delete, it removes that row from the table. So we can delete all of these and they all disappear. So to achieve this, we will remove the row from state, and React will pre-render the component with the new array which has the given row removed. So in app.js, we will create a function that gets called when we click a delete button. So we'll say const handle delete click, and this will be equal to an arrow function, which will accept a contact ID. This ID will be used to find the index of that contact and remove them from the contact array. So it's similar to what we did with the edit. In here, we'll say const new contacts is equal to a copy of the current contacts array. So this is similar to what we have done before. We're just creating a new array based on the current contacts as to not mutate the state. Then we will get the index by using the find index method. So we'll say const index equals contacts dot find index, and we'll pass in our arrow function, which will get the current contact as a parameter. And then we'll say contact dot ID is equal to the contact ID that was passed in to the function. Now we have the index. Next, we will use the splice method to remove the contact object at the given index in the array. So we'll say new contacts dot splice, and the splice array function takes two parameters: the index of the item in that array that we want to remove. So we'll say index, comma, 1. So this just indicates how many elements to remove. In this case, we want to remove the 1. And finally, we'll save this into state. So we'll say set contacts and pass in our new contacts. So our delete button is going to live in the read-only row component beside the edit button. So we will pass this function in as props. So we'll say handle delete click is equal to handle delete click, like so. So in our read-only row, we will destructure this by saying handle delete click, like so. And just beside the edit button, or just below the edit button, we will add a new button with a type of button, and we will say delete as the button text. And we want to pass in our click handler. So we'll say onClick is equal to handle delete click. And we'll pass in our arrow function, which calls our handle delete click function, and pass in the contact dot ID, which we get from the contact that was passed in to this component. Whenever we call a function like this and we pass parameters, we must do it within an arrow function, as this prevents the function that we're calling to be invoked straight away. We don't want that to happen. We want the function to be called when the onClick happens. So now if we save this, and if we open up Chrome, you can see our delete button has appeared over here. If we delete Tony, you can see he gets removed from the rows. If we keep deleting, you can see the rows gradually disappear. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe and share this video with your friends. Thanks for watching.